Hello again, everybody. This is Pavo from UCLA here to tell you a tale of two cities that sought to end exclusionary zoning within their boundaries, Culver City and Santa Monica. I mentioned in my lecture on state efforts to overturn exclusionary zoning practices that a few local governments had done it. Famously, Minneapolis was the first. In California, Sacramento was the first, and Berkeley, I think, was the second. But I'm pretty familiar with the story of Santa Monica and Culver City. I'm a member of the advocacy group in Culver City that has pushed this and campaigned to get single-family zoning rules changed here. So I thought it might be interesting to tell the story, and actually it turned out to be much more interesting than I thought to compare Santa Monica to Culver City, because unexpectedly, given Santa Monica's history, it did not go through with its plan to radically transform single-family zones, even though they are much more affluent than single-family zones in Culver City. Culver City is going through with its plan, and as I'll show in this mini lecture, kind of the reason turns out to be pretty clear as to why Santa Monica stopped. But I constructed a more complicated set of explanations and hypotheses before I learned that reason. So I'm going to go through those because I think it might be interesting for you all to think through kind of the questions in local politics and what are the different factors at play locally to getting exclusionary zoning rules changed. So short lecture, hopefully, ending exclusionary housing locally. Why did Culver City recently move to end single family zoning on its own, but Santa Monica didn't? And I guess I should start by saying, as I said in the earlier lecture, I still don't think this is kind of a viable large scale approach to changing housing exclusionary zoning nationwide because it is so hard to get one city to change its rules. And even in the case of Culver City, I don't think the rule changes are going to be significant enough, right? So I think they're good. They're one step in the right direction, but they are definitely not putting apartment buildings in the most affluent neighborhoods. They're putting fourplexes in the most affluent neighborhoods, hopefully. Okay, so quick background. The cities of Culver City and Santa Monica make a nice comparison. They're pretty close to one another in the west side of Los Angeles. They both have a high jobs to housing ratio, although Culver City's is now much worse, meaning they're kind of job centers with some dormitory neighborhoods within them. They're both pretty affluent. West LA is the part of the region that has kind of better weather and more history of exclusion and more affluence. So the fact that Santa Monica did not go through with its incipient plans to end single family zoning may be surprising to some, and the fact that Culver City did may also be surprising to some if you know a bit about their reputation and their history. So Santa Monica has a reputation as a progressive city. It adopted rent controls, pretty stringent rent controls back in 1979. There was a group of progressives at that time that created an organization called Santa Monica for Renters' Rights, or Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights, that has the great acronym of SMR. And so SMR has been an important political force in Santa Monica on a bunch of issues since 1979, right? So they have done a number of different things around housing and other urban policies that are associated with progressive action, right? So they have inclusionary housing. They've been great on getting affordable housing built compared to a lot of cities in the region, right? So they have 35 LIHTC projects. They've got a great bike lane program. I love it. They've been putting those green paint in a way that the city of LA should be doing. So in early this year, 2021, as part of their housing element update, remember I talked about one of the benefits of the housing element update process is that every 8 years, cities have to revisit the housing element of their general plan. And if there happens to be a progressive movement in that city that can be advocates at that time, it's an opportunity for change to happen, right? So it forces an opportunity for change, essentially. And so at that time, they began a discussion, and it seemed like it was going to happen, of a pretty aggressive set of changes to R1 zones and an affordable housing overlay zone and other things. It didn't end up happening. Culver City, on the other hand, historically is not known as a progressive city, right? It was a sundown town in the 1940s, meaning that residents tried to maintain its racial segregation by preventing Black households from buying houses here. The founder of Culver City, Harry Culver, sold it as a kind of model city. I don't think he said model white city, but he used a lot of dog whistly kind of racially coded languages. Its police force has a reputation for racial profiling. They famously, when I was a teenager, hired one of the officers that beat Rodney King onto the Culver City police force after that incident. There are only 2 LIHTC projects in the city. And so, its past wouldn't suggest that it's going to be progressive on the housing issues. But in recent years, the city has changed a lot. So it has attracted a ton of tech companies, streaming, Amazon, HBO, all these, like the streaming divisions of these companies are all located in Culver City now. It has a bunch of video game companies. So it has a lot of new, very affluent residents. As a result, housing has gotten really expensive here. And the city, as part of its general plan update, right? So it's updating its housing element because it has to. But as I'll mention, it's also updating its general plan, so covering all the elements of its general plan. It decided to go through a 4-plex proposal in R1 neighborhoods. Before the state bill SB9 that made that happen everywhere, Culver City was already doing. Okay, a couple stats. So Santa Monica's bigger, Santa Monica's wider. We're about the same income. Housing is more expensive in Santa Monica. It's on the beach and we are not. Rents are higher. Our jobs to housing ratio is much worse. I think we have one of the worst jobs to housing ratios in the region. We have 60,000 jobs in Culver City and 20,000 households or fewer. Okay, so here was my idea of constructing a bunch of different factors I think could be playing in the success or failure of a local initiative to get exclusionary zoning rules changed, right? And there's this idea of the window of opportunity from public policy that I think is a useful one when thinking about making change, right? So, sometimes different things are aligned to give you an opportunity. Things are in the news, so people are moving on policing. Things are in the planning process forces you to look at your housing element, so that's an opportunity, right? So there are different things that happen that give you this opportunity, and then depending on existing advocacy groups, the willingness of council members, the appetites of council members, the agenda setting power of the mayor, the willingness and capacity of staff, the kind of process that's underway, maybe some latent underlying geography questions, all these different factors I think could influence the eventual result. So I tried to summarize, so in the green and red, right, I'm saying, how is Santa Monica different from Culver City, right? So I think in terms of public opinion and public arguments, it's hard to summarize. I think it's not that different, but we can get to that later. The public arguments, I haven't done a thorough comparison of public comments in Santa Monica to public comments in Culver City. I think they're not that different in the end. A lot of the opposition comments, range from kind of benign, if we do this, what about traffic, to more, don't turn our city into, LA, they like to say. In terms of advocacy groups, there are some noticeable differences. So Culver City, as I'll show you, has an organized group around expanding opportunities for housing construction, right? Culver City for more homes. Santa Monica doesn't. So kind of the main progressive advocacy group there on housing is SMER, which is a renters' rights organization. The council members kind of have a similar majority, although individually they're quite different. So in Santa Monica, they had a sort of 4-3 majority on the progressive side, and we have a strong 3-2 majority on the progressive side. But the details matter with the council members. The mayor matters a lot, as we'll see. The staff and consultants, Santa Monica has a great planning department. We have a great planning department. Theirs is bigger. They've done more housing things. I think maybe they would have had more capacity in Santa Monica than Culver City. I mentioned the type of process. Ultimately, I don't think this is why things played out differently, but it could have been, they were only updating the housing element, which looks at housing programs and considers rezonings kind of as an afterthought. Whereas we were looking at the general plan, the entire general plan, which includes the land use plan, the land use element. And so the land use was on the table from the beginning, whereas in Santa Monica, it was more a housing process, and then maybe we'll need to rezone. I think the geography of single family zones is quite different, as I'll show you. Santa Monica's kind of north of Wilshire, north of Montana, is all affluent single family neighborhoods, and south half of the city is where the multifamily and lower, more diverse neighborhoods are, lower income, less rich neighborhoods, less affluent neighborhoods. Culver City, everything is much more scattered around. I don't know whether that matters, but it's definitely a difference between the two cities. Okay, so Culver City, as I mentioned, is having this moment of change. It's really exciting, and if people are interested in local change, I think our former mayor and council member Megan Solly-Wells is a great person to talk to, as well as current city council members, the kind of three progressive ones, Daniel Lee, Alex Fish, and Yasmin McMorrin. They're all doing really great things in a position that's basically a volunteer position that requires a lot of their time and requires them to be up to date on a lot of things and to kind of have to listen to people that are very angry. When they're seeking to undertake a significant change like this, it's really a kind of labor of love, I think. But so Megan Solly-Wells no longer, so she termed out, but she set us up for this moment by initiating a general plan update process and also consolidating elections, right? So that local governments often had their elections at a separate, not on November 6th, and as a result have super low turnout in regressive and bad ways, problematic ways. A lot of cities are now aligning their elections with the general election. I think that changes who votes to make things more progressive in general, right? So the tentative progressive majority on council became solid 3-2 in the 2020 election. But the progressive, kind of the incipient progressive council had already led in Culver City on several fronts before they thought about the zoning issue, right? So they had adopted a temporary rent control initiative, the first housing action in 2019. Then they made it permanent. They also supported a ballot initiative put on the ballot by Alex Fish, council member, of a real estate transfer tax, a progressive real estate transfer tax. It's awesome. So these kind of progressive moves, a big conversation about defunding the police, had activated conservative advocacy groups, especially one called Protect Culver City, which, as I'll show you some of their messaging, I think it's actually working against them, right? So they're this kind of proto-fascist right-wing group in many ways. And I think kind of a lot of them are Democrats in quotations, right? But I think the way they're advocating against these progressive changes is working against them. That was not the case in Santa Monica. So we, as I'm on the General Plan Advisory Committee and the Housing Technical Advisory Committee. So this kind of land use map, potential land use scenarios was discussed at a couple different points and modified. We pushed the consultants to revise their original ideas about land uses. And then this came to council at this epic meeting with hundreds of long public comments till 1 a.m. If you want to listen to it, it's got an interesting set of arguments about why the city shouldn't end single family zoning, or if you want to see a tweet thread about it, somebody did one of those. So ultimately we came to this land use alternative as a map of the land uses, and you can see the kind of orangey, reddy, orangey, yellowy is where the single family is. And in the end, all of the single family neighborhoods are being considered for what's called incremental infill 1, which is like fourplexes essentially. This is just to mention, and I'm going to put these on if you want to see like the work of this advocacy organization, Culver City for More Homes. I think it's done a great job on their website. They have these really nice videos making the case for why we need multifamily housing everywhere in the city, from teachers, from Isabella. There's a creative guy named Patrick who has made a bunch of really funny videos about allowing more housing in Culver City that I've linked to there. We also benefit from having those entertainment industry types, writers for TV shows and such in this city that can help when they get inspired to help these kinds of causes. Okay, here's Protect Culver City. You can tell by that black shield that they're a little creepy. There's an article about their founder, Ron Basilian, in this link, right? Their messaging is, legibly Trumpian in many ways, kind of right-wing in many ways, right? They talk about vagrancy and crimes a lot. They talk about reckless upzoning plans. They talk about transparency. They talk about the forgotten resident, the moderate resident who feels spurned by council. Yeah, if you look at their website, you will see a lot more of this kind of language. And, you know, I think they ran a really aggressive campaign against the progressive city council members during the election, where they put like a red circle with like a cross out their face, like don't vote for these people. You know, the timing may be a coincidence, but the 2 of the 3 progressive city council people are the first Black city council people in the history of the city of Culver City, and so the kind of their messaging around like targeting these candidates, the first 2 Black city council members, you know, it doesn't make them look good combined with all the other things. Okay, so turning to Santa Monica, SMER is Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights. This is the organization that started up rent control back in 1979, has been an important political force in Santa Monica around renters' rights for a long time. And they kind of, in this progressive era of the 70s, they're a little bit kind of slow growth progressives. Some might call Malthusian-ish progressives, right? They made a deal with the homeowners in the north part of the city, basically, that we'll leave you guys alone, and we're gonna do progressive rental protections in the south part of the city, which is, I mean, it's been fantastic for the south part of the city. Santa Monica has maintained a pretty diverse half of its city for a long time, when other parts of LA did not, because of their rent control programs and their affordable housing production programs. So they've really done a lot of good. However, when it comes to changing zoning, they're not convinced, I don't think. So here's a map that just shows kind of the north part of the city, where the darker blue is where the higher income neighborhoods are. And this is a map, but I'll discuss this map actually next week. I want to talk about citing affordable housing and affirmatively for fair housing, how they're not doing it like almost no city is. But just to show you the map and kind of where affordable housing sites are located versus the wealthier parts of the city. Okay, so in terms of opposition, Santa Monica has the opposition groups to this zoning reform were not these kind of aggressive right-wing-ish groups. They were these nice kind of liberal NIMBY homeowner groups like Santa Monica Northeast Neighbors and North of Montana Association. So they're kind of benign, but they did organize like a pretty aggressive email campaign against the idea of changing the zoning, mostly with arguments around kind of, you know, what about the infrastructure and the tree canopy and all these kind of other concerns, rather than like, you know, you'll allow poor people to live here. Okay, so I had a couple of thoughts about why this didn't happen in Santa Monica, and it did happen in Culver City, but then it came down actually to just one person's decision. So the leader in Santa Monica of the effort to change zoning was named Kevin McCune. He had been a Santa Monica City Council member for a very long time, a big member of the Santa Monica Renters' Rights, right? So he's a progressive council member there for many years and very active on many different issues around renters' rights. And he was the one that had been advocating for this approach on the city council. He abruptly quit in the middle of the meeting that they're going to discuss it. He abruptly quit and basically disappeared. And so without his support for it, the other 3 people that were going to go along with it lost interest and were convinced in part by arguments against it, it seemed like, and it kind of fell flat. So it's a very interesting story how, you know, a planning commissioner in Santa Monica had gotten motivated to start this conversation, actually hearsay, by reading The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. She got motivated, and in the planning commission kind of started this idea of really transforming the single family neighborhoods as exclusionary zoning and undoing that. And then this got passed to council out of planning commission, and Kevin McCune had carried it forward and gotten the other 3 council members to support it. And then, you know, they had asked staff to come back with some plans around an affordable housing overlay zone, expanding R2 into the R1 zone. So it's going to be even more than 4 plexes in a lot of the single family zone, 6 plexes. But then he just abruptly resigned from council during the middle of the meeting. So that is unfortunate. I had constructed a lot of these complicated reasons why it didn't happen in Santa Monica, and it is happening in Culver City. I really hope our mayor, Alex Fish, doesn't resign. I don't think he will. And we can speculate about why he resigned. Rumor has it that people on the Santa Monica for Renters' Rights group were opposed to it for reasons. I think a lot of their conversation was about being worried about speculators and being opposing development kind of in general. I think, one of the legacies in California of the slow growth movement and kind of progressive opposition to capitalism opposes changing zoning because developers will make money. So it's something we can all discuss in our classes, whether that's a good reason to oppose changes to zoning in a place like Santa Monica. So that's my story. Thanks for listening to me. And if you have any questions, reach out via email. See you later.